Get out of my seat before I have you removed." The words didn't arrive as a question. They arrived as a verdict already decided, already delivered the way certain people speak when they have never once been told no and fully expect that record to continue. The woman's manicured hand fingers wrapped in a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the overhead cabin light like a fistful of tiny approvals dug into the shoulder of the man in seat 1A and pulled. Not tapped, not nudged. Pulled with the kind of force that wasn't really about a seat at all, and everyone in that first-class cabin felt the difference, even if no one said it out loud. The man's name was Calvin Reed. He was 44 years old, wearing a dark hoodie, faded jeans, and a pair of scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. He had been sitting quietly, with a folded copy of the Wall Street Journal resting across his knee, and a cup of black coffee balanced on the tray table, and in the half-second it took for everything to change. The coffee tipped and spilled dark and slow across his lap, bleeding into the denim in a wide, irreversible stain, and the newspaper slid from his hands and landed on the carpet with a soft, final sound that somehow felt louder than it should have. The woman who had done this, Diane Pierce. 53 years old, platinum silver hair, swept into a rigid, practiced chignon, wearing a cream-colored Hermes scarf and a skirt that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, lowered herself into the seat Calvin had just been removed from with the slow, deliberate ease of someone correcting an error that should never have occurred in the first place. She crossed her legs. She adjusted the bracelet. She smoothed the fabric of her skirt across her knees. And then she exhaled, just once the way people exhale when something that was bothering them has finally been resolved. Calvin stood in the aisle. His shoulders were straight, not hunched, and his hands were open at his sides, not clenched. He didn't move toward her, didn't retreat, didn't look around the cabin for backup the way someone uncertain of themselves might. He just stood there with the boarding pass still between two of his fingers, the ink slightly smeared from the coffee that had splashed his hand, but the seat number still perfectly readable. 1II, clear as anything printed in black on white paper that had not changed and would not change regardless of who decided to disbelieve it. He looked at the boarding pass. Then he looked at her. "You are sitting in my seat," he said. 7 words. Not loud. Not angry. The way you state a fact, when you have no doubt that it's a fact, and you're simply waiting for the other person to catch up with reality. Diane didn't look up right away. She finished smoothing her skirt first. Then she lifted her gaze to him slowly, clinically, and let her eyes move from his face, down to the hoodie, to the jeans, to the coffee spreading across the worn denim, to the scuffed edges of his shoes. A full inventory conducted in about 3 seconds. And then she looked back up with a smile that had been practiced so many times. It came out perfectly, even though it contained absolutely nothing warm. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "You're confused. Not wrong. Not mistaken. Confused." The word hung in the recycled air of the first-class cabin, like something with weight to it, and everyone within 4 rows heard it, and no one said anything at all. Behind Calvin somewhere, in row 2, a 17-year-old girl named Jada raised her phone slowly, instinctively. The way young people do when they sense that something is happening, that the world should see. The small red recording light blinked on. She didn't announce it. She just held it steady, and the viewer count in the corner of her screen, which had been 0 a moment ago, began to climb. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 held 22 passengers that morning, and in the 30 seconds after Diane Pierce took Calvin Reed's seat, every single one of them made a decision, not out loud, not with words, but with their bodies, their eyes, the precise angle at which they tilted their heads or found something very interesting to look at that wasn't the aisle. In row 3, a retired couple, the husband in a pressed polo shirt, The wife, with reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair, exchanged a look that carried an entire conversation in it, without either of them speaking. The husband looked away first. The wife looked at Calvin for a moment longer, and something moved across her face that she didn't act on. In seat 1C, a businessman in his late 40s lowered his glasses, slightly peered over the frame at the scene unfolding 3 feet in front of him, and then raised the glasses again and went back to his laptop screen with the focused efficiency of a man who has decided that whatever is happening is not his problem to solve. And in seat 2B, directly across the narrow aisle from where all of this was occurring, sat Eleanor Voss, 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Columbus, Ohio, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck and a library paperback open in her lap, who was not looking at Calvin, was not looking at Diane, was not looking at the crew, but was instead watching the hands of everyone involved with the quiet, attentive precision of someone who has spent 40 years noticing what people do when they think no one is paying attention. Diane performed for the room the way people perform when they believe the room already agrees with them. She straightened in the seat and announced in a voice just loud enough to carry past Calvin into the rows behind him that she flew this route every single month, that she always sat here, that she had no idea how something like this happened, that it was really quite baffling when people ended up somewhere they didn't belong. She used the word belong twice. Both times Calvin heard it, and both times his face didn't change. He said again quietly that the seat was his, and the boarding pass confirmed it. Diane let out a soft laugh, polished, effortless, the kind of laugh that had been ending conversations for her entire adult life, and suggested that perhaps he had wandered into the wrong cabin, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the plane without actually looking in that direction. 2 rows behind Calvin, a man leaned toward his travel companion and said something in a low voice. Calvin couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable, and he heard it, the way you hear something that confirms what you already knew but hoped wasn't true. Jada's phone stayed up. Her viewer count was climbing steadily now, 40, 60, 112, and she hadn't said a word into the camera yet because she didn't need to. The picture was speaking for itself. Calvin took one slow, controlled breath. It wasn't the breath of a man losing his composure. It was the breath of a man who had just finished calculating something important. How far this was going to go, what it was going to cost, and whether the people in this cabin had any idea what they were actually watching. His phone was in his jacket pocket. He did not reach for it. Not yet. He just stood in the aisle boarding pass between his fingers and waited with the particular patience of someone who already knows how the story ends. 5 hours earlier, at 5:47 in the morning, Calvin Reed had been standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 34th floor office in downtown Chicago, wearing that same hoodie and those same jeans, watching the city come to life below him, with a cup of coffee in one hand and a confidential acquisition file open on his tablet in the other. The file was thick with numbers and legal language, but the number that mattered most, the one that had changed everything at midnight, was $2.3 billion, which was the total value of the transaction that had made Calvin the primary shareholder and chief executive officer of Stratus Airlines, effective as of 12:01 that morning. His chief of staff, Rachel Owens, had sent him a text at 12:04 a.m. that read simply, "Board confirmed. You're official. Get some sleep." Calvin had not gotten any sleep. He had sat in his office reading the operational reports his team had quietly gathered over the previous 6 weeks, complaint logs, staff conduct records, anonymous employee surveys, customer grievance files, and what he had read had not made him want to sleep. It had made him want to see for himself. That was the reason for the hoodie. That was the reason for the jeans and the scuffed shoes and the decision to book the flight under his own name without any notification to the airline's management. Calvin had a rule, one he had developed over 20 years of building and acquiring companies, and the rule was simple. You never really know what you own until you arrive without being expected. The moment people know the boss is watching, everything adjusts. The smiles get wider, the protocols get followed, the problems get hidden behind the good china. Calvin needed to see the bad china. He needed to see what Flight 447 looked like when it thought no one important was on board. He had printed the boarding pass on paper instead of using the app which his assistant had questioned. He told her paper leaves a physical record, which was true. What he didn't say out loud was that his mother had told him that once, a long time ago, that you keep the paper because someday someone might try to tell you that paper doesn't exist. His mother, Miriam Reed, had been a flight attendant for 31 years. She had worked for 3 different airlines, flown millions of miles, and in all that time had never once been upgraded to first class on any airline she served. Not as a courtesy, not as a gesture, not as the kind of small acknowledgement that costs nothing. She had brought Calvin to the airport for the first time when he was 6 years old, and told him that the sky was the one place where nobody could tell you that you didn't belong, because the sky didn't care who your parents were. Calvin had believed her. He had spent 38 years since then, testing whether the people who worked in the sky felt the same way. He had gathered his carry-on, taken the elevator to the lobby, and walked 2 blocks to catch a cab to O'Hare. He had declined the priority boarding lane at the gate when the agent offered it, joining the regular queue, and watching, as he always watched, the way people moved through the space, who got acknowledged, who got ignored, who was greeted, and who was scanned. He had noticed things. He always noticed things. And he had boarded the plane in seat 1A with a newspaper under his arm and a coffee in his hand, and absolutely no intention of telling anyone who he was. That had been the plan. The lead flight attendant arrived from the galley with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to contain problems, before they expanded her heels, precise against the carpet, her smile already fully formed, before she reached the row where Calvin was still standing in the aisle with his coffee-stained jeans and his boarding pass and his extraordinary patience. Her name tag read, Stephanie Cross, and she was mid-30s, composed the kind of professional presence that radiated competence and control in equal measure. Her eyes went to Diane Pierce first. They always went to Diane Pierce first, not because Stephanie had made a conscious decision, but because she had been trained to read a room the way certain people are trained to read a room. And the room was telling her something very specific about who the situation was and who the problem was. And it was doing that entirely based on who was seated and who was standing, who was wearing a Hermes scarf and who was wearing a faded hoodie. And Stephanie absorbed all of that in about a second and a half without realizing she was doing it. "Oh my goodness," she said, leaning toward Diane with genuine concern spreading across her face. "Are you all right?" Diane exhaled dramatically, one hand coming to rest over her chest, as if steadying herself after something harrowing. She explained the situation in careful, reasonable-sounding language. She had arrived to find a man already in her seat. She had asked him to move. Things had become uncomfortable. She simply wanted to sit down and have a peaceful flight. Was that really so much to ask? Stephanie turned to Calvin. It was a single look, clean and complete hoodie. Jeans, shoes, skin, the full picture assembled and evaluated in the same second and a half she had used on Diane, and the conclusion reached in both cases was equally fast, equally certain, and equally unexamined. "Sir," she said, her tone shifting to something more careful, more managed. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Calvin extended it without a word. She took it from his fingers, held it for a moment, not long enough to actually read it, just long enough to appear to have done so, and handed it back. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding," she said. with the smooth, frictionless delivery of someone who has been trained to deliver difficult information in ways that sound like kindness. Economy class is toward the rear of the aircraft. A murmur moved through the nearby rows, quiet and affirming the sound of a crowd that has just heard someone say what they were already thinking. Calvin looked at her steadily. "That says 1A, he replied. 3 words. Still perfectly even. Stephanie's smile thinned by a fraction that most people wouldn't have noticed. She shifted her weight very slightly, angling her body between Calvin and the seat in a way that created a subtle physical boundary, not aggressive, not even fully conscious, but unmistakable to anyone watching closely enough. Which Eleanor Voss was. From seat 2, B. Eleanor's eyes moved from Stephanie's hands, which had never opened the boarding pass fully, which had never held it up to the light, which had returned it, after approximately 2 seconds of theater, to Calvin's face, and then to Diane's, and then back to Stephanie's body position, and something settled behind Eleanor's eyes that looked very much like she had just reached a verdict of her own. Diane sighed softly with relief. Finally, she said, just loud enough. Someone with some common sense. Calvin asked Stephanie calmly if she would please look at the boarding pass again properly, this time the way you actually look at a document when you want to know what it says rather than confirm what you've already decided. Stephanie did not reach for it. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice in a way that was designed to sound private, but was in fact audible to 4 rows of passengers. "I understand this can feel confusing. Your actual seat will be perfectly comfortable." She paused for a half-beat. "I'm sure of it. Perfectly comfortable." The translation was delivered without a single rude word, and everyone within earshot received it perfectly. Douglas Harkin arrived from the front galley with the unhurried authority of a man who is accustomed to being the last word on any given subject. His broad shoulders filling the narrow aisle in a way that reduced the available space for everyone else, and seemed to do so intentionally. He was mid-40s, with a thick build, close-cropped gray at his temples, and the expression of someone who has assessed situations like this one many times before, and found that they generally resolve themselves once sufficient authority is applied in the right direction. He absorbed the scene in approximately 5 seconds. Woman of a certain bearing and presentation settled comfortably in the window seat. Flight attendant positioned correctly. Black man in casual clothes standing in the aisle, boarding pass in hand. The calculation was complete before he opened his mouth. "Sir," he said to Calvin, voice measured the kind of calm that has authority underneath it rather than empathy. "You need to find your correct seat. We are on a schedule, and I won't have this flight delayed any further." Calvin looked at him without flinching, without stepping back, without changing anything about his posture or his expression. "I already did," he said. Harkin's jaw moved slightly. "Don't do this," he said. Quieter now, just for Calvin, and those 3 words landed with a weight that went far beyond seat assignments, carrying in them the full freight of every time someone had said a version of that phrase to a version of this moment. Don't make a scene. Don't be difficult. Don't be the kind of person who creates problems in spaces like this. And Calvin let them land, and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. From the galley curtain at the front of the first-class section, a young flight attendant named Pamela Osei stood with her hand resting on her radio and her eyes on the scene in the aisle. She was in her late 20s, and she had been with Stratus Airlines for 3 years, and she understood the hierarchy of what she was watching Harkin above Stephanie, above her, and she understood what was expected of her, which was to stay out of it, and let the chain of command handle what the chain of command was handling. But she had also been watching Calvin for the last several minutes, and she had seen the boarding pass, and she had seen the way Stephanie looked at it without reading it, and something was sitting in her chest that she didn't know what to do with yet. Diane, sensing that the situation was moving in a satisfying direction, chose this moment to speak to the broader cabin rather than to any one person in particular. She shook her head slowly and said in a voice pitched for an audience that this was exactly what happened when people forgot where they were supposed to be, that standards existed for a reason, that certain spaces had certain expectations, and that it was really quite tiresome when those expectations had to be enforced and manually. In seat 1C, the businessman closed his laptop and reclined slightly. Eyes shut, the physical performance of someone who has decided that sleep is preferable to witness. In row 3, the retired woman whose name was Carol and whose husband was named Walter tightened her hand around Walter's arm. Walter stared at the headrest in front of him. Carol stared at Diane. Jada whispered to her stream, "They haven't even looked at it properly. They already decided." Before he said a single word, they already decided. Her viewer count was past 400 now. Calvin raised the boarding pass again slowly and deliberately, holding it out between 2 fingers, into the open air of the aisle. Not at anyone in particular, just present, visible, available to be examined by anyone willing to look at it. "Read it," he said. Just 2 words. The offer was entirely reasonable, and everyone in the cabin knew it. No one moved toward the document. Not Stephanie, not Harkin, not Diane. It hung in the air between them, a small rectangle of paper that contained the entire truth of the situation, and no one reached for it, which told Calvin everything he needed to know, and told Eleanor Voss everything she had already suspected. Harkin stepped into Calvin's personal space close enough that Calvin would have to either step back or hold his ground, and delivered what he clearly intended to be the final word on the matter, his voice dropping to something low and official sounding. He said that this was Calvin's final warning, that if Calvin did not move to his assigned seat, immediately airport security would be called, and that Harkin strongly recommended Calvin think carefully about what happened next. Calvin looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Call them." 2 words. Quiet. Absolute. The kind of response that lands differently than anyone expects because it isn't defiance in the way people are prepared for defiance. It isn't loud. It isn't physical. It doesn't give anyone anything to react to except the words themselves, which were perfectly reasonable, which was somehow the most unsettling thing of all. The cabin shifted. Not loudly, there were no gasps, no exclamations, but physically in the way people adjust their bodies, when the air pressure changes, when something they thought they understood has revealed itself to be something different. A woman near the window exhaled slowly through her nose. The retired couple in row 3 both straightened slightly, without looking at each other. Stephanie moved to the interphone on the wall, her hand steady, her face professionally composed, and pressed the button. "Gate, this is first class. We have a non-compliant passenger refusing crew instructions and blocking the aisle. Requesting immediate security assistance." The words came out clean and official, and once they were out, they were real, in a way that couldn't be walked back. Diane settled even deeper into the seat at the sound of it uncrossing and recrossing her legs with the leisurely confidence of someone watching a situation resolve itself exactly as predicted. She addressed the nearby passengers in the conversational carrying tone of someone sharing a mildly interesting observation that this sort of thing always seemed to happen, that people pushed and pushed until someone with actual authority had to step in, that it was really a shame it had come to this. Glenn Porter, 58 years old, sitting in seat 2C in a golf shirt embroidered with the logo of a country club he'd belonged to for 12 years, had been flying the Chicago to Atlanta route on Stratus Airlines for 15 years. In 15 years, no one had ever asked him to show his boarding pass a second time. No one had ever questioned whether his seat was his. No one had ever called security because of anything Glenn Porter had done or not done in an airplane cabin. He looked at Harkin. He looked at Calvin. He said nothing. but something was working its way up through his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. When Calvin reached into his jacket pocket, Stephanie's shoulders tensed, and she said quickly, "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them." The instruction landed in the cabin like a dropped weight, and several passengers, who had been trying to look neutral, stopped trying and simply stared. Calvin paused, hand halfway into his pocket, and let the instruction exist in the air for a full 2 seconds, long enough for everyone in earshot to hear exactly what had just been said to a man who had done nothing more than reach into his own pocket. Then he brought his hand out, slowly holding his phone screen dark and perfectly silent. He didn't dial. He didn't tap anything. He held it in his palm, face up, and stood there with it, the way you hold something you're not ready to use, yet not as a threat, not as a performance, but as a promise to himself about what came next. The weight of the unsent call of all the calls he could make and hadn't made yet filled the space around him more completely than any raised voice could have. Jada's hand was trembling slightly. She kept the camera up anyway. "He still hasn't yelled," she told her stream, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hasn't done anything. He's just standing there holding the truth and waiting for someone to be brave enough to look at it." The footsteps came up the jet bridge with the measured, deliberate weight of people who have learned that the pace at which you enter a room tells people something important about what you intend to do in it. Officer Darnell Washington came through the cabin door. First, he was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, without being imposing, with the kind of steady, absorptive eyes that read a room the way experienced readers read a page, taking everything in at once, without lingering on any single detail too long. Behind him came Officer Kim Nakagawa, quieter in her movement, already scanning the faces of the people seated nearby, with the careful attention of someone cataloging reactions rather than just looking at them. Washington saw the lineup immediately. One woman, white, well-dressed, composed, seated comfortably in the window seat of row 1. 3 crew members unified in their positioning, already angled toward the same side of the story. And one man, black casual clothes, completely still standing in the aisle with a piece of paper in his hand. Harkin moved toward Washington before Washington had fully entered the row, which itself told Nakagawa something. "Officers," Harkin said, his voice finding its command register again. "We have a passenger who has refused repeated crew instructions, is blocking the aisle, and is delaying departure for over 200 people. We need him removed immediately." Washington nodded, once the nod of a man who is acknowledging that he has heard something, not the nod of a man who has decided what it means yet. He stepped past Harkin and addressed Calvin directly. "Sir," he said, "I need to understand what's happening here. Can you tell me?" Calvin did not rush. He did not launch into an explanation or a defense or an account of the previous 25 minutes. He simply extended the boarding pass toward Washington, holding it flat in his palm, legible, unambiguous. "Start with this," he said. Washington took it. And unlike every other person who had handled that document in the last half hour, he actually read it, eyes moving across the page, with the unhurried thoroughness of someone for whom reading a document completely before forming a conclusion was simply how things were done. Nakagawa stepped slightly closer and read it over his shoulder. There was a pause, small, maybe 4 seconds, but 4 seconds of silence in a pressurized cabin with 22 passengers watching. Feels considerably longer than 4 seconds, and everyone in the first 3 rows felt it. "This says, Seat 1. Washington said. "Factual, neutral. Not an accusation, not a defense, just the thing the paper said offered into the air as the starting point for whatever happened next. It was the first completely honest sentence anyone in an official capacity had spoken since the situation began, and the simplicity of it after so much performance was almost startling. Harkin stepped in immediately. "Those can be altered. We deal with fraudulent boarding passes regularly. This is a known issue. Did you verify it? Nakagawa asked. Her voice was calm and entirely without hostility, which made the question more difficult to answer rather than less. Harkin paused just a fraction, just a beat, that lasted slightly too long to be comfortable, and said that they had assessed the situation based on the available information. That wasn't the question, Nakagawa said with the same calm. Did you verify the ticket? Stephanie was looking at the floor. Pamela Osei, still at the galley curtain, closed her eyes for a brief moment. Washington looked at Calvin and asked professionally, and without any particular inflection, if he had a piece of identification he could provide. Calvin nodded, reached slowly and openly into his jacket pocket, and produced a wallet from which he removed a driver's license and handed it across. Washington took it, held it in the same steady way he had held the boarding pass, and read it. His eyes moved across the name once. Then they went back to the beginning and read it again, more slowly. This time, the way you reread something when your brain is telling you that what you just read requires a second pass to be certain of. Nakagawa leaned in slightly. Her eyes moved across the card. Something changed in her expression. Not recognition, not quite, but the specific quality of attention that arrives when a piece of information doesn't fit the frame you brought into the room with you, and you have to put the frame down and look at the information without it. Washington looked up from the ID. He looked at Calvin. Really looked the way he hadn't entirely done when he first walked in. Because when he'd walked in, he'd been looking at a scene, and now he was looking at a man. And those were different things entirely. Then he looked at the seat. Then briefly at Diane, who was watching him with the polished patience of someone waiting for a process to confirm what she already knew. What Harkin said, stepping closer, his confidence curdling slightly into something less steady. What is it? This can't be Mr. Reed, Washington said, and the way he said the name, not with fanfare, not with apology, just with a simple quiet wait, stopped Harkin mid-sentence. Could you hold on one moment, please? Washington turned and walked back up the jet bridge. He was gone for less than 45 seconds. Jada counted, she said so softly to her stream, and in those 45 seconds, the cabin recalibrated, without anyone saying anything. Diane recrossed her legs, but her fingers, which had been resting open on the armrest, had curled slightly. Harkin's posture was still upright, but something had gone out of it, like a word that has been corrected mid-pronunciation. Stephanie stood where she was not moving. Eleanor Voss was watching Pamela Osei. She had been watching Pamela for the last several minutes, and what she noticed was that the young flight attendant's shoulders, which had been drawn up and tight for most of this confrontation, had slowly dropped an inch. Like a person who has been holding their breath and has just quietly let it out. Carol in row 3 whispered something to Walter. Walter put his hand over hers. Washington came back through the cabin door. He walked up to Nakagawa and gave her a single small nod, and she gave him one in return. And then he turned toward the crew, not toward Calvin, toward the crew, and what he said next, he said in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. I need you to pull up the passenger manifest on your system. Right now, please. Harkin said with what was left of his authority that he didn't see why that was necessary, that the situation was already clear, that the appropriate next step was removal of the non-compliant passenger and departure of the aircraft. Pull it up, Washington said. Not louder, just more final. Stephanie moved to the service tablet mounted near the galley, her movements precise and automatic, the muscle memory of someone performing a familiar task with very unfamiliar hands. She entered the flight number. She pulled up the manifest. She typed the name that was on the boarding pass and on the driver's license, Calvin James Reed. The result loaded in about 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds were completely silent. Stephanie's hand stopped moving when the screen populated. Not gradually, suddenly, like a machine that has been switched off. Her face, which had been arranged in professional composure for the last 30 minutes, went through several expressions in very rapid succession, none of which she had prepared. Harkin stepped beside her to look at the screen. His jaw moved once soundlessly, like someone beginning a word they have immediately decided not to finish. Calvin had not moved. He had not produced his own phone, had not announced anything, had not said a word. He was still standing in the aisle with the boarding pass in his hand, exactly as he had been standing for the last half hour, which somehow made what was on the screen more complete, not less, because the record had spoken entirely on its own without his help, and no one could say he had manipulated it, or performed it, or arranged it for effect. The screen said in the clean, unambiguous language of an internal airline database that had no reason to lie, and no political position to protect passenger Calvin James Reed, seat assignment 1, a first-class status primary, shareholder/chief executive officer, Stratus Airlines, authority level, full ownership. Diane Pierce turned in the seat. She couldn't see the screen from where she was sitting, but she could see Harkin's face, and Harkin's face was telling her everything the screen was saying, and she watched the information arrive in his expression, the way you watch weather move across a landscape fast, total, and impossible to stop once it has started. Washington turned to Calvin. His posture had shifted, not dramatically, not to anything performative, but the deference that had been absent when he walked in was present now, and it settled into the air between them without ceremony. "Mr. Reed," he said quietly, "I apologize for the delay in addressing this properly." Calvin nodded once. "I know," he said. Just those 2 words, and they contained everything. Not forgiveness, not anger, just the simple acknowledgement of a man who has been in this position before and knows exactly what it cost to get to the moment when someone finally told the truth. The cabin did not erupt. It did not cheer or gasp or break into the kind of dramatic reaction that happens in movies when justice arrives. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways more devastating. It went still in the way that people go still when they realize they have been wrong. Not wrong about a small thing, but wrong about something important. And the wrongness is sitting right there in front of them on a screen that the airline itself generated. And there is absolutely nowhere to put it, except inside themselves. Calvin stepped forward. One step into the space that had been held against him for the better part of 30 minutes, not aggressively, not triumphantly, just forward the way you move when you are reclaiming ground that was always yours, and the reclaiming doesn't require any particular drama, because the ground knows you, and you know the ground. He looked at Harkin first. "You threatened to have me removed," he said, and his voice was the same voice he had been using for the entire conversation, even measured the same temperature it had been when he'd said 7 words to Diane Pierce, and the same temperature it was now for sitting in my own seat. "You called it maintaining order." Harkin met his eyes for a moment, and then found something else to look at. "We were trying to manage the situation," he said. "You were managing a story," Calvin said. "One you decided was true before you asked a single question." He paused to let that settle, not for effect, just because it was true. And truth sometimes needs a moment to be received properly. Not a story about a seat. A story about who was allowed to be in this section of the plane. And you wrote that story in about 2 seconds without evidence, and then you spent the next half hour defending it. He turned to Stephanie. She was not looking at him. She was looking somewhere near his left shoulder, which was the closest she could get to meeting his eyes, without actually doing it. "You had the boarding pass in your hand," he said. "You chose not to read it. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. And you made it very quickly, and I think you know why you made it." Stephanie's chin dropped slightly. Something in her face gave way quietly the way things give way when the pressure of holding a position finally exceeds the strength available to hold it. He turned to Diane. She was still in the seat. She had not moved, though her posture had changed entirely. The composed, claiming ease of earlier was gone, replaced by something more contracted, more careful. The posture of a person who is trying to take up less space, rather than more. The diamond bracelet was still on her wrist, but her hands were in her lap, now one folded over the other, no longer displaying anything. "You took a seat that wasn't yours," Calvin said, looking at her directly, "because you looked at me and decided it couldn't be mine. You didn't think about it. You didn't question it. You just acted on what you assumed, because you've been acting on what you assume for a very long time, and it's never cost you anything before." Diane opened her mouth, closed it. "Would any of this have happened," Calvin said quietly, "if I had been wearing a suit?" The question sat in the cabin like something physical, like a thing that had been placed on a table and could not be removed. No one answered it. No one would answer it, because the answer was in every face in the first-class section in the businessman in 1C, who had gone back to pretending to sleep in Carol and Walter in row 3, who were both looking at the floor now, in the passengers, who had found their phones very interesting when it mattered that they look up. Glenn Porter in seat 2C was not looking at his phone. He was looking at his own hands resting on the tray table, and he was thinking about 15 years of flights on this airline, 15 years of warm greetings and automatic upgrades, and never, not once, being asked to explain himself or prove that he belonged where he was sitting. The thought arrived without invitation and settled in his chest with a weight that was entirely unfamiliar and entirely, he suspected, deserved. Jada lowered her phone for the first time in 40 minutes. Then she raised it again, slowly and deliberately. "I'm keeping this going," she said into it, her voice steadier than it had been in a long time. "People need to see this." Calvin took his phone from his pocket. No hesitation this time, no pause to let anyone wonder about the movement, and dialed Rachel Owens. He put it on speaker. It rang once. "Rachel," he said, when she picked up her voice, immediate and fully alert despite the early hour. "I need you to initiate a full incident review for Flight 447 departing O'Hare this morning." "Understood," she said without asking why. That was what 12 years of working together produced: the ability to read what was underneath a sentence without needing the sentence to carry everything. HR, legal, and operations, all three. "I want the crew roster preserved, every frame of the security footage flagged from the gate through boarding, and I want passenger statements collected before this aircraft pushes back from the gate. Nobody leaves this situation without a record of what they did and what they said." There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of a pen moving a keyboard, the organized activation of a system that had been built for exactly this kind of moment. "Done," Rachel said. "Anything else?" "That's enough for now," Calvin said, and ended the call. Harkin had been watching the conversation with the expression of a man who is standing in a room that is slowly becoming smaller and has not yet found the door. "Mr. Reed," he said, and the title sat awkwardly in his mouth, too formal for the way he had been speaking. 20 minutes ago, not formal enough for what the screen had revealed. "If we could speak somewhere privately, I think we could." "No," Calvin said. The word wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "This happened publicly. Every person in this cabin watched what you did. It stays public." He looked at Harkin for a long moment, studying him. The way you study something you have decided needs to be examined completely before you determine what it requires. "You escalated a situation without verification," he said. "You used the threat of security removal as a pressure tactic against a passenger who had done nothing except hold a boarding pass and ask someone to read it. That is a failure of every leadership responsibility you have in this role, and it will be treated accordingly." He paused. "Your position ends today, effective immediately." Harkin didn't speak. He absorbed the sentence the way a structure absorbs a hit from the outside it held. On the inside, something had shifted permanently. Calvin turned to Stephanie. 6-month suspension, he said. And mandatory retraining, not the kind that takes an afternoon and produces a certificate, but the kind that requires someone to sit in a room and genuinely reckon with what they did and why they did it. Stephanie nodded once, eyes still low. A tear tracked down one cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. He turned then to Pamela Osei, who was still standing at the galley curtain, very still, her hand no longer on her radio. Calvin looked at her for a moment. "You saw what was happening," he said quietly, "and you didn't participate in it. I know that wasn't easy given the position you were in, and I know it cost you something to stand there and do nothing rather than do the wrong thing. That's noted." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and Pamela gave a small nod that said more than she could have put into words. Diane stood up from the seat. She rose slowly, her composure fractured in ways the scarf and the bracelet could not repair, and she said, quickly, and with real urgency in her voice, that she would move immediately, that she would apologize publicly, that she would do whatever was needed to resolve things that she hadn't meant. "You don't fix this by moving to another seat," Calvin said. He looked at her steadily, without cruelty and without comfort. "You fix it by sitting with the question of why you felt completely safe doing what you did. Why it didn't occur to you for even 1 second that you might be wrong. That's not something I can give you. That's something you have to go find on your own." Diane's eyes filled. Her chin trembled once. Then she stepped into the aisle and walked toward the back of the plane, and nobody stopped her, and nobody spoke. Eleanor Voss set her paperback face down on the armrest, removed her reading glasses from where they had been perched, unused on her nose for the last 30 minutes, and stood up from seat 2B with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who has decided that now is the correct moment and is in no rush because the correct moment doesn't require rushing. She addressed Officer Washington directly, making brief, clear eye contact with him first to establish that she was offering something rather than demanding something. She gave her full name, her home address in Columbus, and her phone number. She said she had watched every moment of the situation from the time the boarding pass first changed hands, that she had a clear view of both the document itself and the interactions that followed, and that she would provide a full written statement and would make herself available for any legal or regulatory process that might follow. She sat back down and reopened her book, her point made nothing further needed. Glenn Porter cleared his throat. He was not the kind of man who cleared his throat in public spaces. He was the kind of man who flew business class and kept to himself and considered his own affairs. His own affairs. But something had been working its way up through him for the last 20 minutes, and it had reached a point where keeping it in place required more effort than he was willing to spend. "I've been flying this route for 15 years, he said to no one in particular, but loudly enough for the nearby rows to hear. "I have never once been asked to show my boarding pass a second time. Not once." He looked at the space where Harkin was standing. 15 years. A man in row 4 who had been recording on his phone since around the time Washington walked in raised his free hand. "I have it all," he said simply. "Everything from when the officers boarded. Clear audio and video. I'll send it to whoever needs it." 2 other passengers confirmed the same thing without being asked, the quiet solidarity of people who had been recording separately and were now without coordination offering the same thing. Jada lowered her phone to her lap and spoke to her stream one last time, her voice softer than it had been at any point in the last 40 minutes. "He never yelled," she said. "Not once. He never threatened anyone, never called anyone a name, never raised his voice above a normal conversation. He just held the truth in his hand, this little piece of paper, and waited for someone to be brave enough to look at it. And the whole time they were refusing to look, I was sitting 2 feet away with my phone up. And I want to be honest with you. There was a moment where I almost put it down. When they told me to, I almost did." She paused. "I'm glad I didn't." Pamela Osei stepped out from the galley and walked quietly to Officer Washington. She gave him a brief, steady statement, what she had seen, what had been said, the timeline of events, from the moment she entered the first-class section that morning. Her hands were not trembling. When she was done, she returned to her position, and if anyone noticed that she stood a little straighter than she had before, no one said so. The captain's voice came over the intercom, measured, unhurried, giving nothing away. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay in our departure this morning. We'll begin pushing back shortly, and should be underway momentarily." Calvin sat back into seat 1A. He did not make a production of it. He simply sat down, the leather settling around him exactly the way it had before any of this began. He opened his laptop. The subject line he typed first was "Zero Tolerance Verification Before Escalation." Effective immediately, the plane pushed back from the gate at 7:14. In the morning, 18 minutes behind schedule, and the world outside the windows resumed the indifference it had maintained throughout everything. Ground crews moving with their orange batons, fuel trucks rolling away the flat gray of an early Chicago morning, going about its business with no particular interest in what had just happened. Inside row 1, Calvin worked. The document grew steadily, one line at a time, built from what he had seen and read and known was coming before he ever boarded the flight. Mandatory identity verification, before any escalation protocol could be initiated. An independent passenger advocate present at every major hub, empowered to intervene in crew-passenger conflicts before they compounded. Annual conduct reviews that included passenger feedback integrated at the same weight as managerial assessment. Bias awareness training embedded into the licensing structure rather than offered as an optional supplement. The words came easily because they came from 30 years of watching what happened when systems were designed without the people most affected by them in the room. He paused at one point, not because he had lost his train of thought, but because he was looking out the window at the ground, falling away below, and thinking about his mother. Miriam Reed had spent 31 years in a blue Stratus uniform, the same airline, different ownership, a different era, that was not actually as different as anyone liked to claim, and she had never complained about the work, had loved the work, had loved the sky and the distance and the particular quiet of being above the weather. What she had complained about occasionally in the late evenings, when Calvin was old enough to understand what she was saying, was the way certain things worked in the spaces she inhabited every day, and why they worked that way, and who benefited from them working that way, and who was told to simply adapt. He typed her initials into the acknowledgement section of the document, MR, in a field where his legal team would see it and understand it as a dedication, and where anyone else who happened to read it would have no way of knowing who those two letters belonged to. That felt right. The best things his mother had ever given him were quiet. 2 rows back, Jada had ended her live stream 10 minutes into the flight, and her phone was face down in her lap now. She was watching Calvin work, not with the focused recording attention of someone capturing content, but with the simple interest of a 17-year-old who has just watched something that reorganized a few things inside her that she didn't know needed reorganizing. She would post the full video tonight, and by midnight, it would have more views than anything she had ever recorded, and she would spend the next 2 days in a state of mild astonishment that she had kept her phone up when someone told her to put it down. But right now, she was just watching a man in a hoodie type words into a laptop at 37,000 feet, and thinking about the difference between being brave and just being present, and wondering whether sometimes those were the same thing. Eleanor Voss had returned to her paperback, but she was not reading it. She was holding it at the correct angle for reading, and her eyes were roughly in the direction of the page. But every few minutes, she looked forward to seat 1A with a small, satisfied expression, the expression of a retired schoolteacher who spent 4 decades watching moments arrive for the wrong people before the right one finally got there, and who had not quite given up, hoping that the right one eventually would. Glenn Porter was not looking at anything in particular. He had his tray table down and his hands resting on it open, and he was having a conversation with himself that was quiet and uncomfortable and long overdue. He had been the beneficiary for 15 years of a system he had never been required to examine, because it had never examined him, had never questioned him or asked him to prove himself, or decided in advance what he was doing in a space before he opened his mouth. He would not become a different person on this flight. He knew that. But he had taken a boarding pass receipt from his jacket pocket and written something on the back of it, 4 words, and folded it twice and put it back. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do with it. He thought he might figure that out when he landed. The document was finished. Calvin read it once through carefully, the way you read something before it becomes real, and then sent it. 41,000 employees across Stratus Airlines would receive it before the wheels touched the ground in Atlanta, and the subject line would tell them before they opened it that something had changed, and the content would tell them what that change required of them, and nothing about the document mentioned what had happened on Flight 447 that morning, because what had happened on Flight 447 was not the policy. What had happened on Flight 447 was the reason for the policy, and those were different things, and Calvin understood the difference precisely. He closed the laptop gently. He put his hands on the armrests. He looked forward. Calvin reached down into his carry-on bag and found the Wall Street Journal coffee-stained, crumpled, where it had hit the floor, the front page marked with the dark spread of the spill from earlier that morning. He smoothed it flat against his tray table, pressing the creases out with the side of his hand, the way his mother used to smooth fabric before she folded it, working from the center outward until the wrinkles gave up. Then he folded it once along the original crease, the way it had been folded when he boarded, and slid it into the outer pocket of his carry-on with the same deliberateness he had used in every single action since this morning began. He did not throw it away. It was a record, the same as the boarding pass, the same as the security footage, the same as the initials in the document, the same as Jada's video and Eleanor's written statement, and Glenn's 4 folded words on the back of a receipt. Records were how things were proven. Records were how things changed. His mother had told him that too. Outside the window, at 37,000 feet above a stretch of American geography that no one on the plane could name by looking at it, the lights of a city spread out in the darkness below. Perfect, indifferent grids of street lamps and headlights, and lit windows, every one of them a person who had never been asked to prove they belonged somewhere they already paid to be, or who had been asked that question so many times it had become the background noise of an entire life. The plane moved through the dark above all of it, without slowing, holding its altitude, carrying its 22 first-class passengers and its full load of economy toward Atlanta at 530 miles per hour, and not 1 mile per hour faster for what had happened in row 1. Calvin rested his head back against the headrest and let his eyes close, not in sleep, but in the particular stillness that follows the completion of something that needed to be done, and has now been done. The seat held him without question, the leather, the armrests, the recline. All of it designed for exactly this purpose, which was to hold a person comfortably across a distance, regardless of who that person was. He was already thinking about the next flight, the next policy, the next crew. Briefing that would begin with a different set of expectations than the one that had governed this morning. He was already thinking about 41,000 people reading a subject line before sunrise. He was already thinking about Miriam Reed, who had never sat in seat 1A on any airline she served for 31 years, and who had told her son that the sky didn't care who your parents were, and who had been right about that, and whose initials were now embedded in a document that would outlast this flight by a considerable margin. The seat was his. It always had been. And now for everyone who flew what he owned, the rules that governed whose seat was whose were written by someone who knew exactly what it cost when those rules were wrong. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And drop 3 words in the comments what you felt when that screen lit up.